Okay. It looks like we are recording.
Thank you very much. Okay. This is Charles Moscowitz. This is the first time I've used Zoom, so stick with me, everyone. It might be a little bumpy, but we're going to go with it. All right. And my guest, hold on. My guest is Bryant Welch. He is the author of State of Confusion, Political Manipulation, and the Assault on the American Mind. Now, first of all, Bryant, I recently took a psychology class at community college. It's not something I've ever been an expert at, but I'm interested in the psychological process that you make reference to in your book. How do you define the confused mind, and both as individuals, but also as as an American culture? How are we confused from a psychological standpoint?
Yeah, what I'm doing, Charles, is taking a look at how contemporary contexts are interacting with the functioning of the mind. And while we may disagree amongst one another as to which ways in which it's malfunctioning, I think we are ignoring the realities of the human mind and not noticing the way we are all subjected to tremendous pressures. And those pressures are interfering with the way in which we're functioning. Now, in today's climate, of course, we're dealing with the virus. And I think nothing has been more pronounced to me than the way in which everyone is carrying this added burden. And I think, and I'm afraid what we're going to see in some ways, people are carrying added stress, added burdens, and we're seeing a surprising number of accidents in emergency rooms and what have you. But I've been saying that these forces have been operating on the mind for some time. And it's not something, we take it for granted that the mind keeps up with our evolutionary demands. And I'm saying it's really hard for the human mind to do what it has to do because of a number of forces that are now operating on it. In terms of psychological processes that you asked me about, the biggest job of our mind is to weave our own view of reality. Now, we take reality for granted, but in fact, what we call reality is a process that our mind has gone through out of weaving together all the incredible array of external stimuli from outside us and from the internal stimuli coming up from inside us. And we've got to weave it into a more or less coherent whole. Now, it's not so important in a way that we get it all right, but it is important that we feel it's right, because if we don't, we get very apprehensive and anxious. So the mind going through that process, it is a process. And, we all have very different outcomes. Everybody's reality is different. Human minds are like snowflakes. But it's that process that is dependent upon certain kinds of nutrients, certain kinds of environment in order to be able to function well. And that has been taxed and overworked.
Okay, so, it seems to me that the basic function of the mind is to perceive what is true existence, reality. We need to do that in order to survive, to get through a day. We make thousands even millions of calculations to navigate through our day, and then of course we get into a deeper element of reason and desire and restraint and decision and a lot of things that are dependent upon our values, which I think go back to survival and the desire for the human being to thrive and to have meaning and to sort of like what psychologist Viktor Frankl talked about in his book Search for Meaning, that you need to find a meaning and a purpose, and in that quest I think that we will gravitate towards certain ideas, and sometimes those ideas can be destructive. Now, you talk about in your book, you go back to as an example, the Iraq War. And you point out that after the attack of 9/11, the American people were frightened, and for obvious reasons. I mean, for good reasons. There's a very big, great trauma, and the result was that we had leadership that led us into a war that really had nothing to do with the events of 9/11. And they were able to do that because they were able to manipulate that trauma and that sense that our structure of what we understand to be real and our sense of security had been so badly shaken. Is that an accurate depiction of your thesis there?
Everything you're saying is accurate, but I'd like to put a little bit of a caveat to it, that the issue that the book focuses on, it does talk about manipulation of leaders. But the more important aspect of the book, as I emphasized in the second version of it, is the fact that it was the mind of the audience. It was the mind of the follower who was desperate because they were not able to make sense of things themselves. They were scared to death. And so they were looking for someone to fill in that gap in their own functioning and to tell them what to think, believe, and do. So it's when the mind is in that perplexed state that we're most vulnerable to leadership that isn't necessarily in our own best interest, however we define that.
Well, I mean, I think in your case, and I think quite accurately and interestingly, you're pointing out that in our sense of panic and in our sense of insecurity and terror, really, because we had been assaulted by this terrorist group and people had been killed and right in the middle of the heart of New York City. And, this is a terrible trauma, that we were vulnerable to suggestion on a mass level by our leaders in terms of what to do. And we were looking to them to do something. And in that case, they got us embroiled in this war. I think that, would it not be accurate to say that you could make that claim with regard to a lot of wars that the United States have gotten involved in? I mean, including World Wars I and World Wars II. I mean, was really, Germany a threat to the United States? I mean, we got swept up in, I don't want to use the word propaganda, but, kind of a mass marketing campaign because we felt vulnerable to what was going on. And we were convinced that we were under assault and that we had to respond by sending, literally going out and fighting these people and stopping them. And I mean, I think that there's an element to that in any war, probably. I mean, maybe, I don't know, I suppose, the Civil War was more of a moral cause, and the American Revolution probably was more of a moral cause also. But I'm talking about maybe in more modern times. I mean, you could say that about any of these wars, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the dangers of not managing the mind is the tendency to go to war when it's rarely in anyone's interest. We can all disagree on which war was meritorious and which wasn't. I'm not a pacifist, but I think the point you're making is very apt, that it is the workings of the vulnerabilities of the mind that I'm talking about in the book are exactly the kind of vulnerabilities that get exploited and have been exploited throughout history. Now, one thing I would say about modern times is, with the amazing power of modern media, it's stunning what kind of impact you can have. And you and I were talking a minute ago about the way anyone can have a media platform, and that's good. But if you look at the power of those platforms, beginning in 1960, I just think when media came in and you could have the visceral experience of comparing what it felt like to see John Kennedy and compare it to the visceral experience of Richard Nixon, it was a whole different ballgame. And I'm not a fan of Nixon, but there was no question he was more experienced and in some ways qualified than Kennedy. But when you added the chance to go right inside the human mind with the kind of experience that Kennedy created, it was just a game changer. And that's only increased as
Right.
people began to understand that.
Well, I think that, back then there was really only three big media outlets. Those were the three the big, ABC, CBS, and NBC. And they kind of dictated what we saw, what we heard, what we thought in many ways. They decided, and their editors decided what we would see and not see. They would, they were really in a position like that. And then in print, I'd say the New York Times is the big one, but there's a couple of other big print outlets that kind of all the other outlets followed their lead, and they kind of set the tone. I mean, I remember, Walter Cronkite, and that's the way it is. He sat up in his perch and he would announce, I mean, to think of the arrogance of that is incredible, but putting aside what you might think of him. But then it became fractured, and now we have hundreds of media outlets. We've got this show. I mean, it's not a big outlet, but we have people who are disseminating all kinds of information, cable and satellite and Sirius XM and now YouTube. And I think that there are attempts on the part of YouTube to try to censor and regulate, and that's been going on more recently. But the bigger picture is that they can't do it the way they used to. And now you have just a huge, massive expansion of opinion, which I think is good. I think it's very democratic.
I think it's a mixed bag. I completely agree with you that it's more democratic. It has a lot of advantages. There are pieces that also have evolved out of it that are worrisome. They're all competing with one another for attention. And the attention they get requires or makes them, I think they're probably aptly, I think they're correct. It requires them to stimulate. So what you have is constantly sensationalized news from any point on the political spectrum you want to get it. So,
Right.
The stimulation, as I talk about, there is a psychological price we pay for this constant stimulation of the mind, which is already overstimulated. So you get
Point
that,
well taken.
and then you get the kind of segmentation of the market, where people just tune in to what they want to hear. So while you and I think of diversity of opinion as supporting strong, pluralistic kinds of thinking, the fact, I think empirically what you find is people are only listening to one kind of news outlet, which is the one they start with. So it reinforces the rigidity of of the mind and the mindset, and people kind of hunker down into it. I'm obviously at the liberal end of the political spectrum, and so my friends tend to watch CNN and what have you. But I increasingly am watching Fox News because if I don't see it, I don't get what's going on in the country. Now,
I'm glad you brought that up because, Bryant, I mean, I'll just give a quick little anecdote here because I tend to be on the right side of the political spectrum. And I've noticed when I started to get involved in radio, this was like 1999, 2000, I went to Tufts University, which is near where I live, and they gave me a radio show. And I went in there and I was really the only conservative. I mean, everybody showed up with blue hair and nose rings, and it was like a real, right? I mean, it was a real
those are
scene.
my friends.
People on your side. All right, anyway. But I had a really good time, and people were mostly very, respectful toward me. And we had some great, passionate, ribald debates on the air at that time. And shortly after, I had a lot of very prominent men and women of the left on my show, including Noam Chomsky, who did a series with me, and the late Howard Zinn and Gloria Steinem. Barney Frank came on with me quite a few times. I ended up running against him for Congress.
Is that right?
Yeah, in 2004.
One of my old.
There you go. And I had a long list of liberal intellectuals and media figures and thinkers, and conservatives as well. And it was amazing. And then I got out of it for a lot of reasons. And about 15, 20 years later, in 2016, the year Donald Trump was elected, I went back to Tufts and once again wanted to have a radio show. But it was a whole different atmosphere. It was like Rumpelstiltskin. I was like asleep, and then all of a sudden I woke up again.
Yeah.
People were very unfriendly, frightened. They kept their heads low. Nobody would really talk to me. Liberals that I knew would not come on with me, not because of me personally, but just they didn't want to talk to me. I mean, it was like very, and I think it had everything to do with the election of Donald Trump. And what happened to me at Tufts was that somebody didn't like something that I said, and they reported me to this, I don't know what you'd call it, this quote enforcement office, the diversity office, I don't know, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And then they did an article on me, attacking me very viciously. And then they gave me a 4:00 in the morning slot. And so I got the message.
Oh, God.
The point I'm making here is that there's a different atmosphere now.
It's very different.
And I mean, I'm proud of you for coming on with me, even though you didn't realize I'm a conservative, but that's okay. I mean, the point is that it's very difficult for me to now continue with this kind of left-right talk. And I'm concerned about that because I think both sides, as you were saying earlier, have become so fragmented and polarized, and one side does not listen to the other side, so they don't really know what's actually going on in this country, because you're going to get only one side of it. And it's concerning because I think it could ultimately, and maybe I'm exaggerating here, but I do think that it could lead to a civil war. Because, I mean, if you looked at this country 10 years before the American Civil War, you had that going on. You had both sides that become so separate that they weren't talking to each other anymore.
I couldn't agree with you more. I couldn't agree with you more. And I do talk about this in State of Confusion, but I wrote the first version of it, 2006, 7, and then I did a update of it that came out 2018. And while I talk about this, I think the overarching most important point of it is what you're describing now. And I kind of put it more maybe front and center. That it takes a strength of mind to be able to tolerate difference. And if I'm dependent upon my reality sense, my sense of what's real and what's not, to feel secure, and if I'm shaky about that, when I see someone who has a different reality sense, it's threatening. Mm-hmm. The shakier the mind is in that fundamental task I'm talking about, the less able it is to tolerate these differences. In this country, we've had differences from day one that were profound and ugly and all the rest. But more or less, with a few exceptions, we were able to muddle through, not with great aplomb always, but we got through it. Now, I remember, Ted Kennedy saying one time in the political fray, he said, these people don't want to just defeat you, they want to destroy you. Right. And I think that is really a terribly dangerous situation. But I do attribute it to the vulnerability I'm talking about in the mind. That, you and I can sit and really have a very amicable discussion about your differences. And, I'm sure they're there and all the rest. But the overarching umbrella that holds us together is a form of mental strength, that you're not threatened by me having difference of view, and I'm not threatened by you having differences of view. And that's that's psychological strength.
It is, and I think that I'm concerned, and you might want to comment on this, that there has been a major breakdown since the election of Trump. And I mean, I could go into how I've seen this play out in my own life with people that I'm close to who won't speak to me anymore because they know I voted for Trump. Yeah. And situations that I've come across that are hair-raising. It used to be the case that when another party was elected and another president, you go into the loyal opposition. You would critique the policies. You might not like the person. You may, but yet it didn't quite reach this kind of a huge chasm where people are viscerally so upset and become completely triggered by everything. And I wonder why do you think that is? What do you attribute that to? If you agree with me, that is.
I totally agree with you. And I worked in Washington largely for the American Psychological Association for about 17 years. And I can remember a Saturday night going to the Palm restaurant and walking in, and there was Bob Dole and Robert Strauss, who was the chairman of the Democratic Party, and their wives sitting there having dinner together, just the four of them.
Hmm.
And you know, it was a social dinner. They liked each other. And you know, it just was a critical way in which Washington held together.
Right.
And the why, I think they are the factors that I talked about in the book, that the mind, there have been the pace of change has been so astronomical, and the resulting dislocations on important supportive factors, you know, the dissolution of the family. You know, we're now talking about the fact that more than half of marriages will end in divorce, but we long ago gave up talking about the fact that our kids don't oftentimes grow up around grandparents, and the sense of alienation. I mean, our elderly, they're dying being warehoused in nursing homes, and it's just very different. You're in Boston. My dad grew up in Melrose, and you know, they were Irish, and they fought, and there were awful things they did to each other, but they all died together, and the relatives, the generations, stayed together. And that
Right.
really is important to your personal sense of stability and security. So there's the economic change. There's the intensification of the bombardment of political rhetoric that we're talking about, of what you can do. I mentioned it in terms of TV alone now, and you add social media. And all of that is overstimulating and bombarding the mind, and everyone is clinging for something rigid to hold on to.
And yeah, I mean, it's a very you give an accurate depiction of the kind of the fragmenting of the nuclear family, and I mean, certainly that's the case in my own family also. And but I want to bring it a little back to Trump and the effects that he's having. I think that it's not enough to oppose him. They want to stop him and to really, you know, end his presidency. He's a big threat to people, and I don't think that it's really, to my way of thinking, he's a pretty conventional conservative president. At least that's how he's governed. I mean, maybe in the beginning we didn't know what was going to happen because he's such a loose cannon. But you know, this kind of animus is unhealthy. I mean, put up some ideas that might counter his ideas and his policies, and then there's an election, rather than this attempt to literally overthrow him and this kind of like drumbeat of animosity where they extract every little word that he says and they bring it up the flagpole and, oh my God, look what he said. And it's a distortion of I think what's really going on. Now, I'm not saying that he's the nicest guy in the world either here, but you know, the treatment, I would argue, has been very unfair, and I think that Trump is quite right when he points that out. It's not normal. It's not a normal opposition. It's not constructive. It's more like, you know, look, I mean, I'll give you one example. Even yesterday, the big story on all three major networks, Mike Pence went to a meeting and he didn't wear a mask. Okay, fine. But this is like, people are weeping over this. I mean, I'm not kidding. I mean, oh my God. I mean, isn't there more important things that we can talk about? Is it gotten to be that kind of petty now that every little thing has to be rung up like a big, you know, 6 o'clock, you know, I used to get these, I mean, this was during, I mean, I got bombshell, you know, bulletins from the Boston Globe on my cell phone. Oh my God, Stormy Daniels said this, you know, it's like, come on. I mean, this is like, you know, it's not constructive.
I think listening to you is fascinating. I really do mean that. I feel like it's like I'm looking at a mirror of myself, but from the opposite from the opposite perspective. And it is fascinating. And I'm living now in Sausalito, California, where, you know, when Trump was elected, it was serious depression. I mean, it
Yeah.
was.
I mean, at Tufts, they had romper rooms for the students so they could go there and play with Play-Doh. I mean, you know, look, I get the fact they didn't like his election, but a free and open election in this country is something that we should all celebrate. I mean, I celebrated when Obama was elected, even though I didn't vote for him. And I thought it was a great thing that here you had an African American in the office with a good family, and it was a great moment. I think everyone felt that way, whether they liked him or not, or most people did.
So let me try.
But now we have this trauma. Oh my God, people are like with their, you know, weeping and, you know, belly aching over it.
So let me try to answer your question of, you know, it is fascinating, and the answer to why people are so upset is, in my view, as I'm reading their minds, is they are scared to death. They are scared to death.
Okay.
And, you know, we can disagree about it, but I think in terms of the psychological dynamics, it is exactly the same on both sides.
Well, I'd ask you, what are they so afraid of, and who is responsible for ginning up that kind of fear? I mean, you know, to my way of thinking, I mean, all this talk, oh, Trump is spying for the Russians and this sort of stuff. You know, yeah, people are scared, and they hear this day after day, and he's like a tool of the Soviets. Reminds me of what they claimed Joe McCarthy did, right? The Reds, there's a whiskey under every bed. I mean, you know, it's like a resurrection of the darker elements of the Cold War against Trump.
Well,
And it's all, you know, it's nonsense. It's like, you know, he's not I mean, if he was spying for the Russians, that would have been the biggest story in 200 years. I mean, you know, it's kind of like these manufactured crises and everybody's so triggered by that. I think it's everything that you're talking about with the confusion.
well, it is, and as I'm saying, it's an interesting experience for me. I personally was very concerned about this guy's involvement with Putin, and we can probably have you know.
Do you think he was a spy for the Russians? I mean, it seems the whole thing was ludicrous, and it turned out to be ludicrous according to the Mueller investigation.
I didn't read Mueller that way.
Okay, well, he didn't call for indictments. I mean,
No,
you know,
no, I felt Mueller came in and viewed it as a prosecuting attorney does. Do we prosecute here? And
well, his job as special counsel was to issue indictments or recommended indictments, and he issued none. Whereas in the past, you had, I mean, Kenneth Starr issued, I think, 5 recommendations for indictment.
You know, there is a whole thing about Trump which does concern me greatly, and to, you know, we can go on to this, but my sense is you and I, the more important point that we're talking about is, why are we this way? Yes, I have grave concerns about our safety with Donald Trump. And I hear you. You feel that these things are, no pun intended, trumped up or whatever. And I get it. When I watch Fox News and I see what they're doing with the day's news, I think, my God, how can these people do this? How can they say this? And, you know, it goes to my reality testing compared to yours. And we can, you know, go into a ring and knock each other's brains out. Which
well, let me see if I could phrase it this way. I mean, look, there are legitimate reasons to either support or oppose the Trump administration, or to like or dislike Trump as a person, and those things are fair. But I mean, this whole thing of questioning his loyalty as an American, questioning his patriotism. I mean, that's not, I mean, there's been no president in history that's been disloyal. There's been some very bad presidents, but they all have tried their best to serve in office and to serve the Constitution. I mean, it's really like it steps beyond legitimate and reasonable opposition and concern for whoever's in office.
Yeah, there is a point of demarcation in the way you and I are forming and formulating our reality. I do see Trump as very, very different from every other president and from every other era. I really do.
Okay.
And I view him from my obviously jaundiced and biased perspective that is me. I see him psychologically as unbelievably dangerous. Now, I have some really good friends in Boston, Massachusetts, who I adore. I really like them, and you can imagine in the mental health community, they are Trumpsters, and you can imagine what that's like for them in the Boston mental health community, and
Exactly.
I can defend them, but I do, it really took a lot of work on my part. It really did. And I think we're all, if you're sitting there feeling like people are coming up with a fantastic, Manchurian Candidate 7 days in May kind of thing and projecting it onto this guy just because he's whatever he is, I get it. I see why it would make your blood boil. And
Well, it concerns me because people are actually believing this stuff. There's the Ruski conspiracy. It's a conspiracy theories. I mean, and also, it's, the general charge is that you say that you feel that he's dangerous. And I think that maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're getting at is that there's a concern that he might be fascist. He might be like a totalitarian. But that's obviously not true. I mean, if he was, I think the perfect example of that is how he's handled the pandemic. I mean, there have been calls from for example, Mayor de Blasio of New York for him to nationalize whole segments of American industry. I mean, there have been calls to set up camps for people who are contagious. I mean, Trump hasn't done any of that. He's been very kind of conservative. He did invoke the emergency powers, but he's used them very sparingly. In fact, the criticism from liberals is he has to do more. He has to step in and declare a national emergency and take over. But he's been, for better or for worse, he has been, very much kind of a conservative approach, a constitutional approach, by working with the states and by the federal government doing its piece and the states doing their piece. Now, we could argue on whether it's sufficient, but it's hardly been anything close to an authoritarian approach. It's in fact been quite the opposite.
No, I agree with you, and I'm not sure that my worry is less that he fits into some particular point on the political spectrum. My worry is that he is a very, very primitive personality structure that is really dangerously obsessed with himself and how he's being perceived and what he's getting in the way of personal gratification, to the point where I really fear for our safety. And the coronavirus, I don't think, and at what point should someone be so alarmed with the coronavirus? Should it have been, January 15th, February 15th, or whatever? But I think the psychological style was a primitive denial, then a primitive scapegoating, a primitive avoidance, and what have you. So I'm responding, I don't think I'm responding to political or theoretical ideological differences the psychology that I see front and center with the guy scares the bejesus out of me. Now, I mean, I think you wisely led us to this point because, and it's helpful to me, I get it. When you hear manifestations of what's in my mind, if it doesn't jive with your reality sense, yeah, I'd strike you as very weird and one of
Not
the
at all.
blue hair.
No, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I hear that all the time.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, I live in that world.
yeah.
Um, I mean, I'd say that we can legitimately criticize Trump's approach to the pandemic, and maybe it does have to do with his somewhat, weird and obsessive personality. I always thought there was something, because I read his book, Art of the Deal, years ago, long before he was running, for president. And I thought it was a fascinating book, but there was something not weird, but there's certain quirks about his personality that are hard to explain. And yet, he was aware of, he reacted imperfectly, but he did immediately respond by banning travel from China in January. And I remember at the time, and of course, he gave an exemption to American citizens and green card holders, but, he did stop something like 90% of travel from China into this country. And he did it because he knew that there was a contagious disease in China. And yet he was criticized at the time. People said, oh, you have something against Chinese people, right? You had, here in Boston, we had politicians coming out, in an absolute, huff about this. Oh, he's banning people because he doesn't like Asians, right? And so I think and in fact, Nancy Pelosi actually put a bill before Congress to stop this. It was an imperfect response, but it was at least something better than, like, for example, in Europe, they didn't stop, people coming in until already thousands of people dead in Italy before they got around to it.
Well, the fact that some people from China were stopped from coming here was a good thing.
Right. But it was viciously criticized at the time. You had people banging their chest and, oh, this is another proof that Trump doesn't like someone because they're a minority, which is completely, not rational. I mean, it's just ridiculous in my opinion.
In terms of understanding how our minds work, your mind hangs its hat on that, the China thing. My mind hangs the hat on other things. And okay. So, I view, you've seen the things on CNN of him saying it's all going to disappear and it's all under control.
Sure.
We've got 12
in that sense, it was no different than everyone else. I mean, and he was wrong about that.
Well, I'm now living in California, and our governor, I just don't think I've ever been so pleased with government as I have been out here in this case. And so
Sure.
I'm just saying, no, there were people. It's been a very tough thing. And this is not anti-Trump. I'm just saying.
I understand. And California has been hit very heavily by this, as has Massachusetts. There are some other states that haven't been. I like the fact that each state is able to, it's like Franklin Roosevelt said, the states are the laboratories of democracy. Each state has its own means of dealing with its own situation. So California might be very different than, Alaska or Vermont.
I'm talking about the difficulty for everybody, whether it's Trump or whoever, to have to accept into our view of reality that there's a horrible pandemic coming and we've got to prepare for it.
Understood.
It's so scary. And that's where I'm saying the mind will collapse. And I think some minds have done better in terms of standing up to that psychological pressure and saying, damn it, it's here or it's coming soon. And others did not. And I don't think Trump did a good job in that.
I understand. I mean, I can't think of too many people who can be held blameless either. I mean, Nancy Pelosi was there on Chinese New Year's. Come on down, come into town. This was already late February. I mean, we could point a lot. I mean, there's a lot of that going around, and there was a lot of denial of it. And I do hold Trump. I think I would hold that against Trump, that he could have been a little bit more prescient with regard to what was going on sooner. that's a legitimate criticism.
But the point and I think a virtue of the dialogue we're having is, it is fascinating because, you raised the China thing, and I have to say, yes, that's a point. That's a decent point. And then I've got all these other things that I think are decent points. But it just depends on these gradations in our mind of what it is that permeates, what's permeating my stimulus barrier that doesn't permeate your stimulus barrier, or what triggers off my paranoid mechanisms that doesn't make you paranoid. I think it's fascinating, and we got to get some perspective and respect for that, so we don't, as you say, get into a civil war with each other.
I agree. I mean, look at it. That's the very thesis I'm presenting here.
I hear it.
Yeah, and yet at the same time, I do think that there are some very serious and probably irreconcilable differences between, liberals and conservatives, and that's real. The point is, do we really want to rip the whole fabric of the country apart in our debate on this? I mean, America has always been a balancing act. We've always, if you look at all the way back to Washington, I mean, it shifts a little to the left, a little to the right, a little to the left. And right now with our administration, it's shifted a little to the right. So get over it.
Yeah.
It's sort of like be a loyal opposition and make legitimate criticism. But, this kind of scorched earth kind of stuff that I see day after day, it's destructive. And it's not going to be helpful to the long term in terms of how we relate to each other.
And that's the point. That's the point I was making about, Ted Kennedy's quote about they want to destroy you. And I think Trump is more a symptom of that than a cause of it. I don't mean he doesn't contribute whatever, but I think it began, I was in Washington, in the 80s and 90s, and that's when it really started. Around 92, 94, when Clinton became president, and the tension between Clinton and Gingrich. It got nasty. The dialogue got nasty. And, every Democratic leader, congressional leader, I don't know if you're Speaker Wright, Tony Coelho, Dan Rostenkowski, they all got kind of assassinated. They all came up with serious ethics charges, and they all had to leave. It was
right.
Things got a lot nastier then. And so I don't think I don't think we can lay that one on Trump. And I think he is a master at living in that world. And yes, I think he does divisive things, but I don't think he started it. I think he's playing to the mind, our minds, as we have let them evolve. And I'm saying we got to pay more attention to this one organ of our body, the mind, that really is driving the ship.
I agree with that. And I mean, the only thing I would add from my perspective is that I think Trump is a almost a counter-revolutionary figure. He has broken through the sort of the leftward swing of this country that's been going on probably for the past half a century. And he's challenged it with simple language, even if he can be crude, and he can certainly be cruel. He speaks plainly. He doesn't have, filters and consultants telling him what to say, and he uses lots of double talk. The language of that French scholar Elaine Benescon called the language of totalitarianism. Double meanings, double language, sophistries and vagaries. And I think that's why he appeals. And I think that liberals don't really understand that.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I think you are articulating, people do gnash their teeth at what they think is the irrational part of Trump. Well, be that as it may, I think you are explaining that he does reach a lot of people on exactly the levels you're talking about, and for better or worse. And I would argue.
No, I agree. I mean, look, whether you like it or not, he articulates a policy. And I mean, I'll just give you an example. Obama, and for that matter, Bill Clinton, year after year, talked about in the States of the Union and regularly, we have to control the borders. We have to stop illegal immigration. giving long speeches about that, but everybody knew they didn't mean it. Trump does mean it,
Yeah.
right?
No,
So
no,
that's the
I think
difference.
that's valid.
He
And
says the same thing, but the point is that the reason people are upset on the liberal side is because he's actually telling the truth. I mean, he did mean this. He wasn't just throwing it out there so as boo bait for the bubbas. I mean, he went in and he meant it. And to me, that's something that, for better or worse, I mean, that gets to, you know, a certain, I think, honesty and a certain something that we should expect. Not that he doesn't lie. I mean, I understand that too. But
no, I
you
think
know,
I think you are right that Trump appeals to people in a lot of those ways, and I agree with you. The liberal community does not get it.
anyways, Bryant Welch, it's a great conversation.
Likewise.
We should do it again. You know, let's stay in touch.
My pleasure.
And I appreciate you helping me out with some of these technologies here. So
Sure. Well,
I want to thank you for joining me, and send me the show when it's downloaded.
I thought you were going to say send me the bill, but
No.
okay, Charles, it's been a pleasure.
Right.
And I'm going to try to shut this off now.
Okay.
And
just click the unrecord button.
Got it. Take care.
All right. Thanks a lot, Brian.
Bye-bye.
But
Will do.
all right. Thanks.